Welcome to Supercool, the show about low-carbon innovations now scaling. Each week, we talk with the founders, CEOs, and executives whose companies are winning customers, growing revenue, and capturing market share by turning carbon-cutting ideas into competitive advantage. This is the rise of the low-carbon economy, a multi-trillion-dollar transformation already underway. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. A quick note about a new course from Supercool before we jump into today's show. If you've been listening to the show for a while, first of all, thank you. And second, you've heard me talk about some of the sustainable ventures I've launched, from my first sustainable furniture company called Vivavi in 2004 to my most recent venture, Planted, a maker of carbon-negative building materials, which Fast Company named one of the world's most innovative companies in 2024. As a founder, I've come to realize that building really awesome climate innovation is half the challenge. The other half is getting the market to adopt it, and often that part's even harder. So after interviewing 50 of the world's most innovative climate companies through this podcast, I started to see the same tactics and patterns emerge for how today's leaders effectively drive sales, scale revenue, and win new business. We built the Supercool Climate Adoption Playbook to distill these approaches into 5 easy-to-understand adoption levers so every operator working on climate solutions can use them too. The course is 8 modules, comprised of 20 fast-paced, real-world case studies that show you exactly what today's climate winners are doing. And in about 2 hours, you'll get up to speed on the strategies you can apply immediately in your business or organization. If you're building in the climate space, check out the course. You can find it at getsuper.cool/playbook. Now for today's show. A decade ago, I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, to raise our family in one of the most beautifully situated small cities in the country, right in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I had a new venture in mind, launching a men's sustainable clothing company, and I started spending time in mills across the Carolinas. But then I was recruited and took a job leading an initiative to build Asheville's high-growth startup community. We built the city's angel investor network, its mentor program for founders, launched weekly event series like 1 million cups of coffee, and built constant connectivity among founders, investors, and talent. Naturally, I met lots of entrepreneurs and those I would classify as the would-be entrepreneurs, the doers, the dreamers, and the ones who lived in the foothills and dressed like Neo, straight out of the Matrix, the ones who'd swore they'd invented limitless energy machines, and the ones building mind software to control vehicles with their thoughts. You get the idea. So one day, a man walks into my office with a plan to build high-rise buildings out of wood. And though this was only just a decade ago, it honestly sounded just as out of touch with reality as the other schemes I was regularly pitched. Large, tall, commercial buildings made out of wood, something called mass timber, using an approach called cross-laminated timber, or CLT. I was like, this dude is living in an alternative universe. And the thing is, it is simply staggering to see what's transpired across the US and the globe ever since. Now, I'm not sure he was the right entrepreneur for the business, but he was right about the future, and I was wrong to be dismissive. Mass timber is on an exponential growth curve. A decade ago, there were only a handful of buildings using cross-laminated timber in the US, essentially large wood planks that are glued together. Today, there are over 2,000 buildings, and by 2034, that number is projected to reach 24,000. But early mass timber was boutique, bespoke designs for institutional buildings destined for architecture magazines, beautiful libraries, stunning hotels with massive glulam beams, expensive, limited to clients with sustainability budgets willing to pay a premium, or those for whom aesthetics trumped everything else. And that is not how you scale a building material. To go mainstream, mass timber needed to become precisely what Sterling Structural, a 75-year-old lumber company, is now operationalizing. Mass timber for the masses, repeatable and modular, not a premium product, but price competitive with steel and concrete. A drop-in replacement for the building systems contractors already understand. In 2015, Sterling started manufacturing cross-laminated timber, and today they're the world's largest manufacturer, producing one panel every 65 seconds at 2 facilities and sourcing 100% domestic lumber. In 2024, Sterling manufactured its 1 millionth panel. Their materials show up in projects like Amazon's new fulfillment center in Elkhart, Illinois, where the company provided over 1,100 prefabricated CLT panels. My guest is Michaela Harms, Vice President of Mass Timber at Sterling. And her career arc has a lot in common with mass timber's ascendants. Michaela grew up in Wisconsin, surrounded by forests, and started building with alternative techniques like cob and adobe, working on farms and constructing natural buildings in the desert. Then she did something few would dream of. She took a train to the Finnish embassy in Baltimore, passed an entrance exam, and moved to Helsinki to study sustainable building engineering. In Finland, she learned about wood construction. She came back to the US to work in heavy timber manufacturing and forestry auditing, and she had the same realization about mass timber that Gary Hirschberg, founder of Stonyfield Farm, had years ago about organic yogurt. If you want impact at scale, you can't stay niche or boutique. You have to take it as massive and as mainstream as Walmart or Amazon. Michaela and I talk about how mass timber went mainstream in 1 decade, how Sterling makes CLT fit what the market demands, the carbon and forestry benefits of building with wood instead of steel and concrete, and why scale for the industry isn't about a sustainability story, but instead about competing on price, speed, and practicality. Here's my conversation with Michaela. Michaela, welcome to Supercool.
Well, thank you so much. Excited to be here.
You and I were just talking briefly before coming on air, and one of the things that has shocked me in following this industry pretty closely is how quickly it's gone from an idea, talking about mass timber, that was a head scratcher, certainly in the US, and the US is a little bit further behind some other places, but a head scratcher in the US just a decade ago to, I don't know if I would say total adoption, but when you look at the kinds of companies who are building mass timber buildings, aka Amazon, which I know is a big project that Sterling and you all were involved in, it's unbelievable how fast this industry is moving into the mainstream. So with that, welcome, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, and then we'll get into your story and Sterling and all of it.
It's absolutely incredible to see just from the beginning of my career, because it was like that. People were like, what is this? What do you do? Even my family was like, what the heck do you do? I don't understand this at all. But now, like, it's on NPR and there's local news stations talking about mass timber, and it's almost like part of the vernacular. And I think there's a million reasons why that's happened so quickly. One, there is a history of timber building, and so it wasn't that big of a leap. It was just being a more highly engineered product felt new. But I think most of the people that were in that like early, 10 to 15 years ago, starting all this in the US at least, a lot of us came from the heavy timber industry and timber building in general. So it didn't feel like a big switch, but I think it was this almost coming back to returning to these materials as opposed to throwing something totally new out there, even though maybe from the public perspective, it felt so new.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think that does hit on the key resistance was like, wait, what? Tall structures from wood? How is that even possible? Because we've forgotten that prior to steel skyscrapers, I mean, some of the tallest buildings like in New York City were wood structures 100 years ago, right, that were being built at the dawn of the 20th century. So I don't want to leap too far ahead without having a chance to hear a little bit more about your background, what led you to Sterling Structural, and some history of Sterling Structural as well, because I know that this company is now, you're the biggest manufacturer of mass timber or CLT. So we also have to kind of parse like, okay, what do these things actually mean? So biggest, longest history, really a leader in the space. So give us a little bit of your story, how you got there and how you're all positioned today.
Yeah, I grew up in Wisconsin and always had this like great love for the forest. And I give my mom a ton of credit for always having us outside, whether it was kicking us outside, be like, go play, or just bringing us out for like fun hikes. And Wisconsin has this deep, rich history of being a very forest-centric, agricultural-centric economy. And so I think that was like deeply ingrained within me from the beginning. A great friend of mine, Joshua Schultz, he's a professor at Gonzaga University, and he grew up really close to where I grew up. And we both tell the same story of how we got to be structural engineers. And it was after tornadoes around here, one of the best parts was going and taking all the trees that came down and building something cool out of them. So it was kind of fun to share that story with each other and be like, oh, that was really like this little cultural thing from rural Wisconsin. And so I went a roundabout way. When I graduated from high school, I was not the kind of kid that was ready to go to college. I was just I'm really hyperactive. I'm totally kinesthetic, and college just did not speak to me in that way. And so I started working on farms, which is how I got into natural building. I started doing like super adobe buildings and light clay straw and cob, and I was like, whoa, I love this. This is super cool. But not the highest paying industry, So it was really fun and like perfect for where I was in my life, but meandered a little bit more and then found myself going, I was always a math and science person. I always loved engineering. I always loved building stuff, playing with my grandpa's Bronco engine and batteries in his garage when I was a kid. So like, I knew that's where I was headed. So I found a university in Finland, actually, that had this sustainable building engineering program. And I was like, wow, that sounds interesting. And then I was living in Baltimore at the time, so I just took the train to the embassy, took the entrance exam. Somehow I passed the exam and got in. And so I went to this university in Helsinki, Finland for sustainable building engineering. And that was when I was like, oh, wow, this is awesome. But in Finland, we were talking about Sweden being kind of at the forefront of mass timber and that whole region, the Nordic region. All I learned was wood. I didn't learn anything about any other materials. I think I took one concrete class when I was on exchange in Cyprus. Like, I didn't even take it there. And so when I graduated, I was doing some life cycle assessment stuff at the time. But again, I'm so kinesthetic. I'm like, okay, I love that. And we want to be propelling this sustainability piece. But I went back into manufacturing. I got a job at this natural building, heavy timber focused company called Whole Trees, run by Roel Gunderson, a really great back to the land architect who I just was like, this is what this is all connecting. And he was one of those early guys that was talking about CLT, and everybody's like, what are you saying, But we did a lot of heavy timber stuff, and I got involved in the research, got some cooperative grant funding with Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin, and just fell down the rabbit hole of wood products manufacturing, leading me to forestry auditing and testing materials for structural integrity through that career. Now I've landed at Sterling, who is the largest CLT manufacturer in the world. So that's our main product. Our main mass timber product is cross-laminated timber. So it's one of the many mass timber products, right? We produce a panel every 65 seconds at two separate facilities, one south of Chicago and one in Texas. And the thing I love about Sterling is we have 100% domestic focus. So all of our timber, all of our lumber comes from the US. And really from the very base of my career, and I still tell my team this today, like, the reason I get up and do this and why I'm such a fierce advocate for this industry is because what it does for forests and forest communities. So like, I want to get as much lumber into as many buildings to keep sawmills open and to keep loggers working and to keep truckers working, because that's the community I grew up with. We saw pulp mills go down, and we're still seeing sawmill infrastructure go down. And so I just want to drive this amazing, exciting, here now product to lay it all back to healthy forests that'll be here for my kids and your kids and their kids. And that's where we are.
That is an amazing journey. Thank you for sharing. I'm just smiling as you're describing it. And here's what triggers for me listening to your story. When you talk about how you're growing up, where your interest led you, I don't know that it's like a pejorative label, but alternative construction of, let's say, buildings, homes, right? If you're talking about cob or some of the other materials that you were really excited about. And then, the Helsinki thing, that's amazing. That's like, it's just like such an awesome story. I love it. So then you go to Northern Europe, you get this really interesting education. Like you said, you're learning about building, but because you're in the Nordics, in Scandinavia, what you hear is wood, right? Which of course makes a lot of sense. And your path then takes you to Sterling Structural, to a product CLT, to mass timber that is now really over the past decade probably captured more mind share than market share. Like, people are talking about it, and really exciting projects are getting built, and we're going to talk about that too. But what I wanted to say was, I often see today people from industries moving into kind of climate related sustainability work coming from places that are like Clorox, or places that are like Procter & Gamble, or like Goldman Sachs, or just very conventional, mainstream, normal economy. You don't necessarily associate with anything pertaining to climate and sustainability, but they've developed these skill sets where then they transition in and they're helping to propel this. Like,
Yeah.
your journey is like, I'm coming from the alternative side of building into a trend that's now going so mainstream, so fast. And that's really interesting to me, how you are landing in this place of like accelerating, driving this really into the mainstream in a way that the math pencils and the certifications are there. These buildings aren't going to fall down. If they get lit on fire, they're actually like a little stronger and have some really interesting fire resistance characteristics. Okay, we can do this. Let's go. And it's going really fast. But it's an interesting place to come from to get to where you are, to be driving this change into the mainstream at such an accelerated rate. Does that land? Does that make any sense at all?
Oh, 100%. Mass Timber has collected this cast of characters who drive this industry together. You need people with all these different backgrounds and approaches. And, you come from that early sustainability world. I don't even remember who it was, which just kills me, but this very pivotal conversation in my life. And I have a friend who works in regenerative agriculture. And so she came from the super hippy dippy CSA world, but now she's a regenerative agriculture specialist for Gerber. You need these people that have this grassroots start. So this conversation that sticks out in my head is, I remember somebody saying to me, everyone was really pissed at Stonyfield Organic when they went to Walmart. And then I listened to this interview with the CEO or the guy who started it. But what hit me was, he was like, be frustrated with me. That's fine. But man, I just got organic food to the most people I possibly could. That was where I was like, whoa, okay, we live in capitalism. Let's be real. How do you use that to propel and scale impact? Because building adobe buildings in the middle of the desert is super cool. And you are making such a minimal impact on the environment, and it's amazing. But that, and at such a small level, is so different than what I get to do now, which is work with one of the largest private purchasers of Southern pine in the entire country and bring that into, I want it in strip malls. I want it in every type of construction. And that's really big impact. So if I can use the truth of our economic system to take those sustainability, grassroots sustainability initiatives that we all started in, and be honest and be like, okay, we have to make impact, and we have to make large scale impact, and all the small things we do every day matters too, but not the same way this big level does. And so that was really what kind of shifted my mind 15 years ago and made me not just feel okay with it, but that's what drove me. I was like, wait a minute. I'm an engineer who's a pretty good talker, not common. Let's use these skills and connect with the right people. And again, wake up every day with the same mission. Wake up with that mission of, it's for the forest. And I mean that. And I really fit that into every decision I make every day. But there's a whole spectrum of how you get there and how you drive it. So you landed with me 100% that you need that back and forth of who's at the table and how they're pushing an industry forward. And Mass Timber, like I said, coolest cast of characters. It is so fun, all the different people in this industry that are driving this together. And we really are working together. Definitely hits home.
That's awesome. Honestly, I could just talk to you about this for our entire interview, but we're going to move on because I do love those roots as well. And I think it's Gary Hirschberg, right? That was the CEO of Stonyfield. And he was a legend. I mean, if you go back 15, 20 years, as this whole green economy was even becoming a mainstream modern concept and idea. And to me, for the same reason, such a leader in how he was pushing this into the mainstream. Let's talk about the business today. For Sterling, as you're building the business now around CLT, mass timber, what's the dynamic like as you go to market? Are builders, developers finding you? Are you having to do a lot of outreach? Is there a lot of education in that sale? Walk me through that process, who you sell to within an organization, and how these projects are coming out of the ground today.
Another thing that's changed so significantly in the last 10 years, because 10 years ago, you really had to go out, you really had to sell it. There was this conversation around sustainability that was starting, but people were still using the word green, and they were still saying, oh, you're cutting down trees, that's so bad. Fast forward to today, it's just really changed. To be honest, I think sustainability has become more just of a feature. And really what's driving the industry is speed, domestic supply chains, and just this certainty. So our customers really range from installers and general contractors and developers who are looking to set themselves apart a little bit. And every stakeholder has a little bit of a different thing of mass timber that really resonates with them, which I think is super cool because that's what makes that ecosystem having changed so much. So Sterling is a 75-year-old family lumber company with a really cool, deep, rich history and started manufacturing cross-laminated timber in 2015. And that was largely for site access markets. So like temporary roads, for infrastructure development. And it's amazing how big that industry is. That's still a massive part of our business. And so when we started looking at the structural business about 4-5 years ago, we were like, this is kind of a fad, maybe. We're not so sure yet. Let's look at it. I was consulting for them at the time. And as we looked into it, they were like, oh, yeah, we want to go into this. This is cool. Like, this is fun. We can use what we do, put it in another market, and meet the needs of what people are looking for, right? Which, yes, it's sustainability and regenerative materials. That's still very much a part of the conversation. But I hear so much more, especially from contractors and installers, wow, this thing flew up so fast. It was so great that your plant was close enough that we could do a just-in-time shipment on this. We do the prefabrication ahead of time, and so the risk on site is a lot lower. Like, it was more kind of like the benefits of the material logistically, I think, that really now have brought it into the mainstream. So some clients are just like, hey, steel decking is starting to get a little expensive, and it's, it always fluctuates. And this might just be easier to use CLT. You guys are right down the road. And so we have contractors like that. We have contractors and developers who are really motivated by the aesthetics. Like, oh, it's so beautiful. I can get higher rents. I can rent out faster. So I think one of the things that I love so much about the sale of mass timber is there's so many attributes that speak to so many different stakeholders that it's always kind of different. And at this point now, too, I was saying 10 years ago, you really had to go out and like lunch and learn and teach people and tell them what it was. Now it's like, it's nonstop that they come to us. Like, they keep coming in, they ask questions. Hey, I'm really interested in mass timber. I'd love some help getting it in. And so for us, the education piece, there's some great groups out there like Woodworks, a nonprofit funded by the Softwood Lumber Board and the U.S. Forest Service, and they offer free project assistance for people considering mass timber. I think because those institutions have been around long enough, we're much further than where we were, but we still have to hold some hands along the way. And I think the education piece that Sterling takes, so we run on more of a modular format that's really fit for existing sawmill infrastructure. That's the big piece of it. There's a little bit of an education there because at the beginning when mass timber came in, it was like, I think of like the high-end runway, the big, sexy institutional projects, and the architects and engineers, it was just like, whatever you want, we'll make it happen, kind of this high-end thing. And then as we move forward, like we were talking about from the sustainability side, to scale, you got to get repeatable. You got to think about this. So now if you take these modular building blocks, which is a little bit different mentality for design and for, it's like playing with Legos. We got a few boundaries. That's really the education piece that we go through as a company. But it clicks really quickly because like steel decking, like hollow core slab concrete, they're used to these rectangles and then working within that format. And the nice thing with mass timber, we have a nice CNC, so you can do cool things and give it some unique flavor, but can you get a higher percentage of those to that rectangle to ease it for install, to make it more efficient, to limit waste? That's what we work on with designers.
Got it. What I'm hearing is the appeal of your panels, the CLT panels, it could be sustainability. That could be a driver for some clients, but more perhaps, let's say, pressing challenges can be, I need to get a building up and I need that to go fast. And I am really loving working with Sterling and the way that I can get this just in time, delivered fast, and get my building up much quicker than if I were waiting for, let's say, a more legacy material, steel decking or whatever to show up, right? So like there's speed, and then there's pricing, right? So that I can actually do this more affordably, which is like That's awesome. So the sustainable thing can actually just go compete on price. And then it also sounds like while there is an educational component, there's a big enough market that is actually building commercially with prefab sort of rectangular stuff or just with panels. I don't know that it's a one-for-one substitution, but they're accustomed to the format. So in some sense, it's like, it's sort of a drop-in replacement because you're used to working with this sort of format and we can come in and you can work similarly with our product too. That's not everybody. So that's then where there's this educational piece of like, hey, like all this upside, you can go faster and you can have sustainability and the right price point. But let's talk about modular and what that looks like for you, the designer,
Yeah.
you, whoever, right? Like, so, and that's where that sort of education piece is to continue to expand the market for your product.
Oh, absolutely. You nailed it.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm not looking for a job, but I just wanted to make sure that I understood, what's going on. But how do you go from that to, now I know it was only 100 miles away from your factory in Illinois, but how do you go from what you've just described to being part of this, like a very high profile, really interesting Amazon, it sounds like delivery fulfillment center that I think was just announced or launched or went live over the past couple of months, that's kind of state of the art using all of these sustainable technologies and sterling materials, as I've read about and seen some pictures, to create this really beautiful envelope for an Amazon fulfillment center. How do you get there? How do you get to like the world's biggest retailer?
Yeah, I give some of the tech companies credit for driving some of this interest. Over the last 5 years, there has been a big interest from all of the tech companies in more sustainable building portfolios. And a lot of that comes from they've made some big climate promises. And now I think they make these big climate promises and they put together teams and they say, we got to deliver on these. You guys need to come up with a lot of different strategies to deliver on these. And what's cool is each one of them, when they go to buildings, a lot of them end up in timber. Like it seems some of the smartest minds in the world that get nabbed up by these companies to solve these problems continue to go to mass timber as a climate-focused building solution that also meets the needs of, hey, we have to build a lot of stuff too. It's not just like with these one-off things. Like we're building a lot of warehouses, we're building a lot of things. And so that's a testament, I think, to the product itself. And I give them credit for driving that conversation. And with the Amazon warehouse specifically, the engineer who was working on it, KPFF out of Seattle, and they were working with ZGF Architects, they came to us kind of early on, and I give them a bunch of credit for this too. It was like that early work as a team to say, let's solve all the things they're asking for, at least to the best of our abilities, and let's do it together as a group. And that's another thing about mass timber that a lot of people like, it's hard at the very beginning because they're so used to this disjointed construction approach. But mass timber kind of forces, it's like a little kumbaya, I love it. It kind of forces everybody to get together early and make decisions early. They came to us and they said, we're looking at this, we're not quite getting the price right. And it was funny because it was an engineer that I've known for a really long time from my heavy timber days. And we both got on the call and we're like, oh, you're here. Hey, and it was kind of this funny overlap where I got on and talked to them about this more modular format and hey, if we can do a very repeatable system based on the sizes of lumber that exist in the market today, and we can be on a train car to our facility every single day, that's how you get the most cost-effective product. A lot of people go into like these E grades and MSR, machine stress rating, which means higher performance lumber, which is great and very useful for like heavily engineered systems. But for typical buildings, you don't really need all that extra stuff. And it was great. I was at Clemson University last week and I was talking to a sawmill owner there. And it's very hard for me to find those tension laminations or that stress rated stuff. It's a small percentage of lumber. So if you can open up your eyes and say what exists today, build a product off of it, and then design to it, which is exactly what that team did. They said, okay, you make these 16-foot panels. We're going to have these 16-foot steel bays. We're going to lay these panels out. We're just going to go one by one. And every single decision we made along the way made construction faster, made dealing with any logistical challenges faster, and made the price right. Amazon, of course, has this big sustainability initiative and did a great job telling that story in, what did they say, 40-some strategies throughout that entire warehouse. But when it came to the mass timber piece, not only were we talking about sustainability, we looked at every sawmill we sourced from. We did GIS data of where those trees came from, what the replenishment rates were of those forests. We got down to all that data, but ultimately we trusted the supply chain, we verified the supply chain, and we delivered a really easy, repeatable product. And that's kind of, to me, the most like Amazon thing on earth, right? Like that's what they're doing with their business. And so we'd love to see more and more of these general buildings, right? Like how can we get every Starbucks to start building this way? How can we get every one of these, more repeatable buildings to just switch out even just one facet of it? I think one of the things that we've seen with this industry that's finally changing is early on, it was this all-in approach. We have to be all mass timber or no mass timber. And that's not really the right choice for every job, especially a big scalable job. So what I loved about the approach that they took on that warehouse is they said, let's put the right materials in the right place and implement a bunch of other sustainability strategies on top of it. But if you make all these little incremental changes, change out the precast walls for timber walls. One, it's so beautiful. If anybody hasn't seen pictures, definitely go to see all of their beautiful pictures of the Elkhart warehouse for Amazon. But it tells a really great story of a team that came together, solved a problem, did it quickly, could do it again. It wasn't this one-off thing, right? So we love to see those hybrid approaches to buildings and keeping that timber in the building, because we had another job where they went all mass timber and the glulam got really large and it got expensive. And they were going to cut all the mass timber. And we were like, why don't we try steel with the CLT? Like if we put these together, and then totally worked out. The building went up in like 2 weeks. It was an absolute cakewalk. It looks gorgeous. They saved a lot of money. All of us working together and being honest about what's your price point that you need to hit. What are the aesthetic requirements that actually need to be there versus the ones you want? And what speed is this project need to go at? And when you look at those three things in like a little matrix and decide where you truly need to be, you're going to make some different decisions. But you're still going to keep some of those elements. And that's so critical, is evaluating that early and often with your clients so that we're really focused on making sure that we're doing what will actually get built, right? So, and I'm sure you remember that a lot from your building products days. Like if you go all in, sometimes the budget doesn't work, but if you pick the right places, that's where we're going to see this thing scale really like much quicker.
What jumps out to me is when you see mass timber projects today, you'll see like Wallpaper magazine or something Fast Company covers or whatever. Like they're going to show you some absolutely stunning hotel that's mass timber, and it sounds like more like what you're showing. It's very bespoke and may have these like huge glulam beams and everything's wood, and of course it's absolutely stunning. But I can see how that starts to get very expensive and structurally expensive, and just you need a certain part of the market, and awesome. And then if you think about, I think which gets less attention, just this whole swath of the market, which is maybe just a little bit more, well, certainly more price sensitive, but it's such a bigger part of the built world to actually drive like CLT and this change in that part of the market. The come to Jesus, or like the really important realization is, how do we just play in the real world with the real world constraints and necessities of what it's going to take to get into these markets, because these markets are huge, right? If we're cognizant of, we got to hit a price point, we got to hit a speed cadence, and if there's certain aesthetics like nice to haves versus must haves, let's have a real conversation and let's go drive this thing as fast as possible, which you don't really see as much in like Wallpaper or like, I don't know, Dwell or whatever, but is really where it sounds like you can drive massive change, which is what you're doing, right? Like, I love that. I mean, I just think that is just so interesting to think about. And it's really great to hear that that's actually where the industry is moving. And it makes sense that like as your company's scaling and as your peers are scaling, that you're figuring that out, right? I mean, it's crucial.
100%.
There's no other way.
Well, you're coming down from the runway, right? The high fashion couture is all those institutional projects on the cover of Architect magazine. We're making our way down to Target, you know? We gotta like get this in everywhere and get people thinking about it. And this is what I love about a lot of the universities that are really doing a good job of asking the industry, what do we need here? Like, how do we get our students to be well positioned? Like I said, I was at the Clemson Wood Utilization Design Group. They were like, we don't teach mass timber separately. And I told them this is the biggest thing is like, it's just another material. You have to think about it. If we keep putting it on this bespoke other plane, it's always going to stay there and it's only going to be thought of for institutional work. Whereas we see a lot of applications. We did a military hotel at Fort Bragg. Every single piece of that mass timber building is covered in drywall and makes it look like it's not mass timber. But it's all mass timber, and that was really for blast requirements and security reasons and speed of construction. And I would love if all of it was exposed because it was also so beautiful. But it's a Candlewood Suites, and they're like, nope, we want it to look like a Candlewood Suites. We're gonna fit it out like a Candlewood Suites. And great, you know, for me, it's like if you can show it, awesome. If you can't, it's still there. It's still in that building. So this tagline of mass timber for the masses. And it really is that approach of like, how do you get that Stonyfield organic yogurt into Walmart? That's what we want to be doing with cross-laminated timber. I want everyone to have access to it. I want it to just be that other material that just happens to be there. And if you get to enjoy the beauty, even better. But I'm not going to force that either. And what's really powerful in that is what it replaces. We're talking about replacing very energy and resource intensive materials like steel and concrete. And I'm not suggesting we replace all of it. Like, we have to look at these hybrid systems to make these big impacts. So for a mass timber building, about 75% of the carbon sequestration, so that stored carbon in the material, is in the plates. It's in the floors and roofs. So why aren't we focusing there, right? Like, that's what I want to replace. I want to replace all the hollow core slab concrete, steel decking, get it all to be CLT, show it, don't show it. I don't care. That's a massive impact to turning our built environment into a carbon sink and incentivizing good forestry practices that continue to steward forests and keep them around. And that is so powerful. And I think people don't, you know, yes, that beautiful library on the cover of Architect magazine is equally as important, but I can go build a couple of adobe buildings out in the middle of the desert and live there all alone and have very little impact, but I want to make a bigger impact. That's where I just love what we can do at Sterling with that volume and that capacity and really just drive this into an accessible market, because the history of mass timber around here, I actually have one down here. The old barns and agricultural buildings, they were glulam. They were heavy timber. They were mass timber. That was an accessible product. They would sell it door to door, you know? We need to get back there. We need to remember that these natural resources, these are ones that regrow and replenish. When we mine sand for concrete, we don't get that back. There's recycling and there's all these great innovations in every material, so I'm not gonna discount that. Everyone is working on sustainability together, but let's let wood really show off what it can do.
I love mass timber for the masses. I saw that on the Sterling site, which of course we'll link to all that, and the way that it's laid out and aesthetically, and yeah, really what you're saying, and very much speaks to me, thinking like, how do we come down market? How do we do mass timber at like Target? How do we really drive this so that it's for everyone? I love that. Let's, in some of the remaining time we have together, draw that linkage more for me, if you would, to the forest and the forest industry, and what you said is such a big motivator for you, given where you grew up and the industries that are around. How does mass timber help ensure like that industry sustains and does so in a responsible way, recognizing that there is the, let's say, perspective, right or wrong, or the question of like, yeah, but you're cutting down trees, right? So like, how big can this really get? What's the end game for mass timber? How do you respond to that question and think about it from what your motivation is as well?
I will start with, I am not a forester, and I surround myself with a lot of foresters because they are the scientists and they are the people we need to be listening to. And so I think that is number one. Every conversation I've ever had with the true scientists who steward these resources we all share together, they are begging for utilization. They are begging for markets. They are begging for financial incentives for management. That's what they're asking for. So we all need to challenge ourselves and the perspectives that we have when we're not working in it every day. Great example, I was at the American Forest Congress, which is the 9th one. They started like the late 1800s, but it's this event. It was in DC, and there's public policy folks, there's tribal foresters, there's federal foresters, there's just an amazing group of people, wood products and environmental NGOs. And there was a breakout session on mass timber. And this question came up, like, is there a concern that mass timber is going to lead to deforestation? Totally valid question. There were a couple of people that were concerned in that room, and the people that were concerned were not foresters. And then I'm kind of a loudmouth, in case you haven't noticed yet. So I was like, what foresters in this room are worried about that mass timber leading to deforestation? None, right? They're like, we need markets. And that's the disconnect between the supply chain that I keep kind of like trying to be this catalyst to talk about. So what happens is, as markets for wood products go down, the incentives for management also go down. What you get is disease. You get overstocking, which is causing the wildfire risk that we see today. And then from a capitalistic view, and we have to be honest with ourselves, if you're a private family forest owner that's owned your forest for generations and generations, and all of a sudden these markets go away, and your local sawmill closes, and your pulp mill closes, and you don't have anywhere to sell your timber, what are you going to do with that land? It was amazing. I heard a forester in South Carolina say this specifically. He said, we are at a ticking time bomb of these families making different decisions of legacy forest land they've owned for generations that has always been regenerative. It has always brought financial stability that incentivizes them to steward it. And that's starting to change because these markets are going down, because we're starting to offshore some of that sourcing. And you talk to any of these foresters, we're getting to an overstocking situation, and we need to bring these industries back, because these industries, woodland economies, thrive on a regenerative back and forth. We harvest off of our forest all the time, whether it's for burning to keep our house warm in cold weather, or to allow space for the young oaks to grow because they're getting choked out by some dead ash that's sitting there, right? And so what's really important now that I understand from all of these legacy groups, whether it's the sawmill infrastructure, the pulp markets, all the foresters from a private, state, tribal, federal, they're all telling the same story. And they're saying, these markets are valuable, and they bring the management back to keep them flowing and keep them moving. And it takes lots of different products. So mass timber is just one, and we are a teeny tiny drop in the bucket. We're so small. I'm working so hard to make us bigger and support more of these sawmills. I think the statistic I heard recently was in the last 2 years, like 200 sawmills have closed. That's a devastating number. And so the more we create markets, the more we use lumber, the more we use paper responsibly, of course, like all these things are with a responsible lens, but the more we keep those markets thriving, the better, because the alternative is now all of our pulp is coming from China, or it's coming from Brazil, or it's coming from these other countries that may not have the same forestry practice. As in the US, we have best management practices at the state level that drive really good forestry. The Clean Air and Water Act drives good forestry. And what that utilization can do for those communities is really important, because it was there. I got to walk around with a tribal forester from the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and this mentality of more of like 700-year cycles. You know, I think with some people get so worried about, oh, but it takes 40 years or 60 years to regenerate. It's a cycle. It's regenerating. There's active volume growth of our forests in this country. And I'll leave it with one thing here, because this, I could stand on a pedestal forever. But Sterling has just made our 1,000th mat this year, or panel. So we've made 1,000, or I'm sorry, 1 million. We've made 1 million CLT panels. In 1 million CLT panels, I ran an analysis with the Woodworks calculator that shows how long it takes to grow the equivalent volume of wood that we used for a million mats. 66 hours. That's it. And so we also have to think about how vast and beautiful and amazing and powerful that resource is. It's a regenerative, constantly growing, constantly turning over, young, old, middle-aged, all of it. All these trees keep growing, that volume keeps growing. So what I ask people is, yes, ask those questions. Challenge us. Tell us you want to know where things are coming from. Tell us you want to know these statistics. You want to meet a forester. You want to walk a forest. But you better be asking the same questions about your iron ore that goes into your steel and the sand that goes into your concrete and the Portland cement that goes in there, because that's not happening. So
Yeah,
that's my soapbox.
Well, good. I'm glad that I struck a nerve there, and I appreciate that perspective. I've found, and when we started Planted, we spent a lot of time with foresters, and we spent a lot of time in North Carolina looking at forestry and trying to understand what's going on the land, having similar conversations. And my experience is when you go engage with foresters, or just like when you go and really engage with farmers, your perceptions of what you think can shift pretty quickly when you're actually talking to people in the field and who are working the land, and you get a different truth, right? And you actually talk to someone who's working that land and stewarding that land. It changes your perspective really quickly from assumptions that you carry, right? If I say, oh, well, we're going to cut down trees, is it deforestation? Like, how much thought have I really given to that? How much analysis have I really done because I think something without having gone deeper? That's just so often the contention. And I think you're absolutely right in that, because this is new in a 21st century context when we think about mass timber, and because it is a challenge to the status quo, then the status quo pushes back, right? And the status quo is, we want to protect the status quo. And I don't really want to question concrete, because if I question concrete, it's not just that I'm questioning concrete. Now, if I question that, that's going to lead to a lot of other questions that are going to get really uncomfortable for me really quickly, right? It's this cascading effect of like, oh, the way I think the world actually is and how benign the world actually is, all of that is now subject to being very, very challenged, and that gets very uncomfortable. So I understand why that pressure, or that contention goes at mass timber, because for many people it's a promise and it's the opportunity, and for many people it's a threat because it's so new and trying to establish itself. And that's an exciting place to be, but it also comes with these other components, right? These other conversations you have to have.
It's so emotional, and I want it to be emotional. We should be thinking that way. But there's also a trust level too. Like, there's a reason I keep calling foresters scientists. They are, and we need to trust them. We need to trust our scientists and believe our scientists and not make up our own science. And so I always say, I'm not a forester. I listen to some of the best foresters, and when I have questions, I call them. When I have questions, I go out and walk a forest with them. And we've learned that's a really valuable tool with architects as well. We've done some AIA lunch and learns where we've gone to a site and then we've taken them with foresters through a forest, because it's all about rebuilding that connection to land and resource. And the more that we do that, the more people are going to just feel the comfort that they do deserve to feel. I'm never going to diminish the fact that it doesn't feel good to watch a forest be taken away, right? But a lot of the deforestation is because we're building other things, because that family couldn't make it financially work anymore. And we're seeing the same thing with farms. And so I think it's cool that both agriculture and forestry is so visual and so in front of us, and we're not separated that way, at least. But this engagement in these conversations, so I really appreciate you opening it, are so valuable and important. Get out and walk a forest too. It's the best part. Get the smell. You got to have that connection.
Absolutely. And now you bring that connection right into a building. So that's
exactly. Oh man, and it feels so good. We live in a little log home here too. It does that biophilia, love of life, and that feeling of being in spaces with any natural materials, as you know very well. It really does change your disposition, and it really does make you feel good. So everybody deserves it. And it should be accessible.
Well, I want to thank you for this conversation. I learned a ton. It was really interesting to hear your journey, how Sterling is positioned in the market, where the market is, mass timber for the masses, and everything that goes into making that value proposition work. And then the tie back, of course, to carbon and to forest. So this is a wonderful conversation, Michaela. I'm so glad to have had it with you and wish you continued success as you're building this market. It's just fantastic to hear about.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying Supercool and appreciate our conversations that merge climate, innovation, and commerce, please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It's the best way you can help the show reach other future-forward decision makers who would benefit from these conversations too. See you next time.